All right, everyone, welcome to GIA Knowledge Sessions. For those of you who are not familiar with it, the Knowledge Sessions are a series of talks and seminars about gemology that are fueled by our decades of research. At GIA, we consider ourselves so fortunate to study and learn from gems, and it's our mission to share our discoveries and learnings about the world. I'm excited to kick things off today. My name is Natalie Jaden. I am the Content Marketing Manager at GIA, and I am joined by Kate Waterman, one of our gemology instructors at the Carlsbad campus. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping things to tell you. Everyone attending this is automatically muted. If you have a question, please submit it in that Q&A spot at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a feature below. Feel free to ask any questions as the talk progresses. There will be a Q&A session at the end where Kate will have the opportunity to answer some of your questions. We will also send a recording of the session later today along with a survey, so we'd love to hear your feedback. And with that, I am going to pass the torch to Kate. Kate?
Thank you so much, Natalie. Appreciate that. So thank you all for joining me. I really hope that you're going to find the history of the engagement ring as interesting as I do. So a couple disclosures before I get into it. This is the history of the engagement ring, not the wedding band, although some of the history is definitely intertwined there. Historic dates often are slightly misaligned or they overlap among references. So we're going to focus on the historical relevance, not necessarily precise dates. We know that current traditions differ around the globe, so we do tend to focus on the United States when discussing more current trends as we move down the timeline. And finally, I don't speak French, Italian, or Latin, so please forgive any of my mispronunciations. So let's first discuss how the tradition of the engagement ring began. Although it is worth noting that the term engagement ring actually didn't exist until relatively recently in history. They would have considered this gift more like a token, and so it was actually often referred to as a hoop in earlier times. So when we talk about the invention of the concept, some credit the ancient Egyptians with inventing the engagement ring. They were using things like braided hemp and reeds and hair. And then it's said that the ancient Greeks adopted this tradition using things like leather and bone and ivory. But reliable data really just traces back to the ancient Romans. We have written accounts and archaeological finds that are evidence of this. So in 200 BCE in ancient Rome, this is where our story begins. So at first they were using things like chains and bracelets, but this eventually evolved into the symbolic ring. The ring really signified a business contract. It wasn't romantic. It symbolized obedience. It meant that one was owned, although some others did believe that it represented handing over control of the household goods. But we started to see metals being used during this time. So things like bronze and copper and silver and even gold, although typically gold was reserved for public officials. So women tended to wear a very simple band, typically made of iron. Pictured here, we have a Roman key ring made of iron, obviously much more ornate than the average person would wear. And then we can move forward into the 2nd century CE, so the Common Era. So things are becoming slightly more romantic. It started to represent a financial sacrifice. That engagement ring was a symbol of true commitment. But marriage, remember, was actually a vow of present consent. It wasn't religious. There was no betrothal ceremony. It wasn't even legally binding at this time. But also during this time, the bride-to-be was often given 2 rings. So there was an iron ring to be worn at home and then perhaps a gold ring to be worn in public. And this was a way for them to show off their affluence. So if you're looking for an excuse for 2 rings, blame the Romans. As we move forward into the 4th century, we started to see some inscriptions. Some elaborate, but most were quite simple, and they embellished the inside of the band. So the ornamentation was really meant to emphasize the symbol of the man's trust with the home. It certainly wasn't meant to ornament the woman or the wife-to-be. So let's talk real quick about some historic references of where to wear it, and we'll sort of move backwards in history. In the 17th century, during George I of England's reign, it actually wasn't unusual for them to wear the engagement ring on the thumb because they were so large. We can move even farther back. In the 11th century, there's French rituals that dictated it be placed on the right hand middle finger. We move further back and we have documents of, in the 7th century, Christian priests touching the betrothal ring to 3 fingers, stating in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And then the priest would be the one to place it on the wife's finger. But we can go even further back in the 5th century, where Macrobius, who was a Roman writer, is typically credited with declaring that the betrothal ring be worn on that 4th finger of the left hand, because it is said that's where the venus amoris is, or that's Latin for the vein of love. He spoke of this vein, which runs from that particular finger straight to the heart. He wrote, because of this nerve, the newly betrothed places the ring on this finger of his spouse as though it were a representation of the heart. This information, he said, he derived from an Egyptian priest, and the tradition has endured through time, although it's actually based on false information. There is no specific vein that goes from that finger to the heart. Eventually, we know that all of our veins lead to our heart. The ring here is a gold ring that's dated around the 5th century. So as we move forward to the 9th century, specifically 850, Pope Nicholas I stated that the engagement ring symbolized a man's intent to marry. So Pope Nicholas was asked to explain the difference between the Roman Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox practices. And so this was the first written account of the connection of the engagement ring with the Catholic tradition specifically. At this time, gold became the material of choice, although it wasn't uncommon for the man, if he wore a ring, to wear the gold version and the woman to wear silver version. And this signified the ranking within the household. Pictured here, we have a gold ring that dates around the 9th century. So a reminder, up until now, marriage was that simple vow of present consent. It wasn't legally binding. Men could and often would not follow through with a formal marriage ceremony, and this would leave the woman shamed and sullied. But at the 12th century, the Christian church established the betrothal ceremony. So perhaps this was when that separate engagement ring and wedding band came to be. In the early 13th century, specifically 1215, Pope Innocent III stated that marriages must be made public in advance. So this symbolized an agreement to marry in the eyes of God, and it really solidified the tradition of a man presenting an engagement ring for that established period before the ceremony. So historically, it wasn't until 1477 that we have the first record of a diamond in an engagement ring. Now, this wasn't the first diamond in jewelry, just specifically in an engagement ring. And Archduke Maximilian of Austria is credited with this for when he proposed to Mary of Burgundy. It said that the engagement ring had tiny diamonds in the shape of an M. Now, whether the M stood for Maximilian or Mary, I don't know. But this actually influenced those of high social class to start giving diamond engagement rings. Although it did not set the precedence for a diamond engagement ring, that really didn't come until the 1900s. So just a side note, at this time in history, very few diamonds have been discovered. So India was actually the only source of diamonds, and these were alluvial, which you can think of as kind of randomly found diamonds. Only the wealthiest possessed them. They typically weren't cut. In fact, the first polished diamond wasn't until the late 1300s, and this was called the point cut. So here we have pictured one of those point cuts. It's unfortunate that the point is actually chipped off. But again, this is the earliest technical cut. But really what they did is follow the octahedral shape, that natural shape of a well-formed diamond, and they just smoothed the rough exterior. So very few of these point cuts exist today because they were recut once technology improved. Now, improved technology during this time really simply meant grinding that point down. The table cut was developed in the 15th century, popular through the 16th century. And those who could afford diamonds might have had their point cut diamonds cut into these table cuts. with this development. So really it's just a flattened top, a flattened culet, and it ends up looking like a square in a square. So here's some additional examples of table cut diamonds in engagement rings. These are from the 17th century. And I want you to note the ornate metal work and a bit of enamel on one of them. And that was meant to counterbalance the diamonds because the table cut really did not have a lot of sparkle like we think of modern day cuts. They didn't accentuate a diamond's ability to return light at this time. So in Brazil, they were starting to discover diamonds in the 1700s, and more diamonds meant more diamonds ending up in engagement rings. Also, more diamonds meant more experimentation with cutting. So in the late 17th century, the rose cut emerged, and that's where the diamond has a domed shape to it, and it definitely offers more sparkle, more light return. However, remember that the diamonds were only for the affluent. So a respectable substitute for a diamond was often rock crystal during this time. Rock crystals are far easier to cut and polish than diamonds, excuse me. And diamonds at this time, they were mainly coming from the Golconda mine in faraway India, a little bit coming out of Brazil. So these rock crystals, although this one looks dark, typically they are colorless like diamonds, they resemble diamonds. And these were mined in Europe, so in the alpine regions of Switzerland and southern Germany and France. So completely respectable substitute for diamond. So at this point in history, engagement rings are definitely becoming more commonplace, although they're fairly simple because of the materials available and those rudimentary methods of fabrication. So I want to look at how those designs really evolved. Well, popular around the 14th century, lasting through the 17th century, was the fede ring from Mano de Fede, which means Italian, or it's Italian for hands in faith. It's two right hands that are clasped, and it's meant to be a symbol of pledging vows or pledging eternal friendship. It is worth noting, though, that this style actually does date back to Roman times. They were found to have been used as engagement rings in medieval and Renaissance Europe. Amazingly enough, this one is from the 3rd century CE. So we're actually going to see how the fede ring evolved into other styles in later years. This is an interpretation of a fede ring, which is incorporating that table cut diamond. This one was probably given as a friendship ring as opposed to an engagement ring. So popular around the 15th century, lasting through the 17th century, was a gimel ring. It's from gemelis, which is derived from geminus, which is Latin for twins. It's also known as the puzzle ring, as you can see sort of from the back of the band. It was traditionally 2 or more bands that fit together to form one ring, and this was meant to symbolize the intertwining of 2 lives. So each the man and the woman would wear one part during the engagement and then reconnect them at the betrothal ceremony for the bride to wear. So many royals used gimel rings to propose marriage. Most notably in 1525, Martin Luther married Katharina von Bora using a gimel ring. The one pictured here dates back to the late 16th century. So today, gimel rings can still be found. In fact, this is a more recent design by the designer Todd Reed. We could also see a combination of design elements like this one, which we could refer to as a fede gimel ring. So that puzzle ring with clasping hands. In fact, this one pictured here, the hands separate to reveal 2 hearts that are engraved with the letters F and M. So these rings were often engraved with things like romantic mottos or phrases from the marriage ceremony or just the names of the couples. And so this really suggests that they were being used as wedding rings. Popular in the 15th through the 18th century was the posy ring, many different spellings for that. But it's named for poser, which is French for poetry. So they would be engraved with short love poems or ballads. And this was meant to reflect the giver's literacy giftedness or their education level. I imagine someone was really trying to show off with this ring. But these posy rings were actually mentioned quite frequently by Shakespeare. And this one pictured here is from the mid-16th century. So there's many varieties of posy rings. These were really popular in England and France, and they were typically exchanged between friends or relatives, lovers, and definitely at those betrothal and wedding ceremonies. Typically, the engagement version would be silver, and then it would be exchanged for gold at the marriage ceremony. This one here is from the 17th century, and it's engraved on the inside with "Hearts united, live contented." Although we're at the mid 17th century now, and the Puritans actually repealed the idea of the engagement ring. They linked it to the clergy, they linked it to the church ritual, they thought of it as very frivolous. And so instead, they would present the woman with a thimble, a very practical item. But after, the woman would actually insist on it, on the basket portion being cut off to create a band after they had the ceremony. And I think that this is actually a unique lesson, because sometimes we can think of jewelry as being frivolous or an expendable luxury, but really some people find very, very deep symbolic meaning with it that just can't be ignored. So in the 17th century, we also saw the cluster ring come into play. And I haven't talked too much about colored stones in engagement rings, but definitely the affluent would want to sort of flaunt their wealth by way of rubies or sapphires or pearls, just to name a few. Here we have a cluster ring from the late 17th century with those table cut rubies. Popular in the 17th and 18th century was the claddagh ring. Notice this is a type of fede ring. Remember, fede meaning the hands clasped in faith. Although we have some additional elements. So the hands represent friendship, that heart there represents love, and the crown is meant to represent loyalty. So the claddagh design is said to have originated in a small fishing village in Galway, although it has definitely come to be known as just a symbol of Ireland itself. And it's kind of neat to have this secret language ring, because how or where it's worn actually conveys the wearer's relationship status. So whether it's worn on the right hand or the left hand with the heart facing in or the heart facing out, it's supposed to have this secret language of that relationship status. They're still popular today, although not commonly used as engagement rings. I myself actually wear a claddagh band that I purchased in Galway when I visited just a few years back. The one pictured here, however, is from the 17th century, and it has some of those rose-cut diamonds. Here's a Dutch adaptation of the claddagh ring from the mid-18th century. All right, so popular in the 18th and 19th centuries was acrostic ring. So this was like the secret language of gemstones, another one of those secret language rings. So typically not worn as an engagement ring. More often it would be used as a promise ring. So sort of a promise of exclusive commitment and intent to engage. Maria Antoinette's jewelry designer, Jean-Baptiste Millero, is credited with inventing this style. So it is when you take the first letter of each gemstone in that piece of jewelry or in that ring, and it spells a secret message to the recipient. So these are special styles for those who could afford. And some of the more common messages that they would write are things like regard or beloved or adore. So you could spell out that you adore your loved one by using an amethyst, a diamond, an opal, a ruby, and an emerald. What I have here is actually a kunzite, an alexandrite, a tanzanite, and an emerald, spelling out my name, Kate. So it's just kind of fun to think, what message would you spell out in gemstones? Popular in the late 19th and early 20th century was the toi et moi ring, French for you and me. It's also known as a crossover ring. So this is a modern interpretation of that fede ring. Instead of the hands coming together, it's gemstones. And these two stones would be set side by side or kind of passing by each other. And this was meant to symbolize two souls intertwining. So in 1776, this trend was really attributed to French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte and his first wife, Josephine. However, it was revived in 1953 when JFK gave one to Jacqueline, really revived this toi et moi style. Pictured here, both of these are from the late 1800s. Another hybrid here, the Toi et Moi Gimel ring. This one is from 1814. So remember Toi et Moi, those two gemstones coming together, and Gimel, you can tell from the back of the band that it's that puzzle ring. Another hybrid here is the Toi et Moi Posy ring. So this is from the 1400s. It's a sapphire and garnet set side by side, inscribed with Oui tout mon cœur, which is French for with all my heart. And pictured here, a unique mixture of design elements. This is from the mid-18th century. Get ready for this. So it has the Toi et Moi element of the two gemstones, the clada element of the heart created by those two pear cuts and the crown, the fere, because the hands are coming together. The gimel, you can tell from the back of the band that it's a puzzle ring, and it's actually a posy ring as well, because it's engraved with gajdamache. I think I hacked that, I'm sorry. But it's a token of friendship. So let's recap some of the styles that defined engagement rings throughout some historical periods. And you will know that some of these historical periods tend to overlap in dates. But let's start out with the Georgian period. So this was 1714 to 1837. This period is defined by grandeur, elegance. There was an excessiveness of affluence, and there was lots of fine silver, high caratage gold, large gemstones. However, they were typically set in closed back mountings. Because of that, often we would see foil back to counteract that lack of cutting ability during this time. And we'd even see them use something called paste, which is really just a simulant or an imitation gem. There's some sub-eras in the Georgian period. Baroque, which is the symmetrical, grand, ornate, and showy period. The Rococo, which is asymmetrical, very elegant and light and delicate. And then the Neoclassical, which is really inspired by Greece and Rome. So it's that boldness, but refined. And then we move into the Victorian period. So this is 1837 to 1901. This was a profoundly creative period for jewelry. There was a resurgence of silver as a really stylish metal. And there were a lot of symbolic themes that started to flourish. So we saw a lot of animal motifs, particularly serpents and snakes, because those represented wisdom. There were a lot of flower motifs because it was said that each flower would symbolize a feeling or an emotion without words, kind of like the language of flowers. And then this is when acrostic jewelry, that acronym or initialism jewelry, is really popular. Remember, the language of gemstones. So this Victorian period can definitely be divided. We have the early part where we saw color, garnets and amethyst and turquoise and enamel to bring color into it. The sub-era during this period was the Romantic period. So it was influenced by classical and Gothic, Renaissance, and then even ancient Greek and Roman mythology. And then as we move into the later part of the Victorian period, there was an emergence of middle class. And then we have some sub-eras there, the Grand Period, which was very much influenced by the Queen's mourning period. So we saw a lot of black materials, jet and onyx, and even black glass during that period. And that moved into the aesthetic period, where we saw a return to refined designs, smaller and lighter. Diamonds were actually reserved for evening events. It was a little taboo to wear your diamonds during the daytime. As we move into the Edwardian period, 1901 to 1910, although sometimes it's extended to 1914. So this is also known as La Belle Époque period, which translates to the good times. The diamond industry really started to take hold, with some major sources being discovered in South Africa during this time. So royalty was based on wealth as opposed to lineage, and also the American market emerged at this time. So we were seeing very ornate pieces. The affluent really wanted to show off their wealth and their rank. So we saw lots of immense detail. Things like scrolls and lace and tassels, garland motifs, open wooden filigree, millgrain embellishments on the edging, very elaborate, but still very delicate. And we started to see platinum's first emergence into the jewelry industry because platinum really helped to achieve that, as it is somewhat of a stronger metal. So this period was really influenced by Parisian architecture, very monochromatic look, white on white on white. And this is said to have been influenced by Robert Pierre's historic exhibition to the North Pole in 1909. To achieve that monochromatic look, they were using platinum and pearls and diamonds. And when it came to diamonds, specifically the marquee cut, because they said it was reminiscent of a racing yacht. Concurrently with the Edwardian period was Art Nouveau. So this was 1890 to 1910, and we saw a backlash against industrialization. So it's really defined by the freeform asymmetry of nature. Things were elegant and organic and flowery. We saw lots of curves and swirls and sweeping lines, a celebration of the female form. This is a time of arts and crafts. So creativity was seen across all the arts during this period. We were seeing lots of alternative metals to platinum. So base metals were coming into play, alternative gems to diamonds. So more organic gems and enamels were being used during the Art Nouveau period. And then we move into Art Deco. This was 1920 to 1945. Art Deco represented the age of the machine. So it was very much influenced by Cubism's geometric forms. Things were bold and angular with very clean lines. It was all about the glamour, all about luxury. Platinum was the primary metal, with white gold beginning to be used in jewelry. Yellow gold was not often seen during the Art Deco period. But what we did see was pops of contrasting colors. So pops of sapphire, ruby, emerald, and onyx. And these would contrast with those colorless diamonds. And actually the halo style of today is a nod to this era. So there was a new wave of feminism that rejected conservatism, and they rejected the traditional femininity. And the Art Deco period was once described as not for the faint of heart, but for the bold of spirit. And then we move into the retro period. This is 1939 to 1950. This overlapped with the late Art Deco period. So this was really inspired by the effects of World War II. So it was meant to counteract those somber clothing styles. There were a lot of softer elements like flowers and butterflies to kind of soften the era's overarching masculinity. A lot of florals and animals were meant to contrast that grave reality of the devastation of the war. Platinum really became scarce, so white, yellow, and rose gold started to emerge. We were seeing lower budget gems like aquamarine and citrine instead of the expensive diamonds and sapphires and rubies and emeralds. So we were seeing sort of the emergence of the concept of semi-precious gemstones during this time. We had the symmetry of the Art Deco, but it carried on to be bolder and larger and stronger. And we often think of the retro period as kind of chunky and playful. And then we moved to mid-century, 1950 to 1965. So in reaction to World War II ending in 1945, we saw much more feminine and elegant styles. So lots of elements of nature or flowers like this piece here, vines and starbursts. And there was actually during this time a real rise in popularity of matching jewelry sets. And then we come into modern time, and some refer to it as mid-century mod, but 1965 to turn of the century. So we were starting to really see abstract things, organic looks, textured yellow gold. We were borrowing from other cultures. So we saw some bohemian influences, and really towards the end of the late 20th century, it was all about more is more. So at this time, just for fun, I thought we could put up a poll and find out what your favorite period is for the engagement ring. We're just going to leave this up for a few moments and then reveal the results in a little bit towards the end of the presentation. But which style is your favorite? Georgian, Victorian, Edwardian, Art Nouveau, Art Deco, retro, or mid-century mod? Feel free to go ahead and fill that out just for fun. All right, so we're going to pick back up with the diamond engagement ring, and we're going to look at how styles really evolved in more recent times. So in 1867, Eureka, diamonds were discovered in South Africa, and the diamond industry really began. So in South Africa, these were the first primary sources. So much more diamonds being discovered. And then that meant an eventual trickle down to the less wealthy. So a market started to develop in the US, although diamonds and engagement rings still remained fairly uncommon until almost the mid-1900s. It is worth noting, however, that in 1886, Charles Louis Tiffany, who was the founder of Tiffany & Company, he introduced the Tiffany setting. This was revolutionary in terms of setting styles. So until then, remember, stones had been set really low, typically in bezel settings where metal goes all the way around. This was a turn away from that. So this is a diamond solitaire, meaning just one single stone, one main stone. It sits high to catch the light, very unusual from how stones were being set in earlier times. And it has since, the term Tiffany setting has since become synonymous with the setting and not necessarily the company. Although you might want to check out Tiffany & Company versus Costco if you want to know a little bit more about that backstory. So in the 1910s, we had the end of the Edwardian period. So we were seeing intricate metal work, a lot of that mill graining to enhance detail. They were using platinum. The 1910s were greatly impacted by World War I. So there was really a shift in focus to all things that supported the war. As we moved into the 1920s, diamonds started to gain traction because more of that supply was coming out of South Africa. With that, the Industrial Revolution had actually allowed for better diamond cutting abilities. So we were starting to see more cut and polished diamonds in engagement rings and other jewelry. And then even during this time, the modern round brilliant cut was developed. So this is the modern round brilliant that we know today. And if you want to learn more, you can learn all about the evolution of diamond cutting in our diamonds and diamond grading course. But this is when that Art Deco style really took hold. Think The Great Gatsby. Everything was glamorous. White gold and platinum was big. Rhinestones and diamonds in geometric shapes like the Asher cut and the emerald cut were really popular. And those rich colored accents that I talked about. We started to see jewelry houses really start to emerge during the 20s. Cartier and Van Cleef and Arpels really take foothold. And then just when diamonds were starting to find their way into culture, the 1930s came around and we entered the Great Depression, which lasted the beginning part of the 1930s. So during this time, diamond engagement rings were a sacrifice luxury in the US. Diamond sales plummeted. Engagement rings really lost their importance and people would start to use substitutes, if anything. So using that paste that I talked about, or even rhinestones, nickel, silver came into play then. But towards the end of the decade, we started to see a reemergence of seeing luxury markets being created, yellow gold coming into style, and that solitaire single stone was really popular because it was simple and at a lower cost because of one single stone. So with the 1940s, World War II impacted engagement ring sales immensely. So platinum was prohibited to be used in jewelry during this time. De Beers came into play and they were really working to keep the diamond industry strong. De Beers was focusing on this idea with diamonds of supply and demand to keep the engagement ring tradition alive. In 1940, department stores started to carry diamond engagement rings, which was sort of revolutionary to see that. The double ring tradition took hold of the engagement ring and a wedding band. And then grooms also started to more commonly wear a wedding band during the 1940s. And then in 1947, De Beers' marketing campaign, A Diamond is Forever, really solidified the notion that a diamond engagement ring was essential to any marriage commitment. So they used a lot of well-known artists in their campaign. They embedded this message into movies to do the campaigning for them, and it worked. So it's noteworthy to look at the fact that over the next 40 years, so 1940 to 1980, the diamond sales rose from 23 million to over 2 billion. So not all diamonds were going into engagement rings, but pretty much all engagement rings were set with a diamond. And in fact, if you look at the cost difference in the 1940s, the average engagement ring was about $1,800 if we adjust for inflation. Today, the average engagement ring is about $5,600. So in the 1950s, it was all about sprays of diamonds. So particularly those baguette cuts, they acted as a sign of renewed prosperity. That World War II ban on platinum was lifted. Remember, the toi et moi style was revived thanks to Jackie O. Lots of bold colors. During this time, Audrey Hepburn started a craze of these stacked, delicate engagement bands. And then in the 1960s, we started to see unexpected center stones being streamlined in white metal. So emeralds, sapphires, rubies were all the rage. Everyone wanted something different, something unique. Celebrity engagement rings had a huge influence during the 60s, particularly Elizabeth Taylor's 33-carat Asher cut diamond. And then we enter the 70s. So with the 70s, the princess cut emerged. The princess cut was developed in the 60s, but it really took hold in the 70s. Yellow gold and bold shapes defined this disco era. Wedding sets made to fit together like puzzle pieces were really popular, kind of a throwback to that Gimel ring. And a lot of cocktail-inspired statement rings were big during the 70s. And then the 80s, it was go big or go home. Over the top, oversized, bling, bling, bling. So think of these swirling lines of baguettes. We had thicker metal bands. White metal was classic, but yellow was the new standard. And during this decade, there was a motto of sort of greed is good. And then remember also at this time, Princess Di's sapphire engagement ring caused a ripple effect of copycats of that. And then in the 1990s, 180-degree turnaround, sorry. It was a reaction to the excessiveness of the 80s. It was all about simplicity, minimalism. That solitaire setting came back. Remember the single stone, along with a very simple and straightforward 3-stone ring. The marquee cut became all the rage. It was said that it was much more refined than the boldness of the 80s of the past decade. And remember that marquee cut is kind of a tip to the Edwardian era. There was a resurgence of white metal during this time, so white gold and platinum, because at this time, yellow gold was really associated sort of with gaudy costume jewelry. And then also, you can't deny it, the internet really changed the way that brides-to-be searched for inspiration for their engagement ring. With the 2000s, it was all about the halo, halo, halo. More bling for your buck. Yellow gold started to come back slowly by way of two-tone pieces. And as we moved to the 2010s, halo, 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 especially around new shapes like the cushion cut. So we can kind of divide the 2010s by the early 2010s, which it was all about round versus princess, skinny pave bands. Rose gold really started to emerge and take hold. And there was a resurgence in colored center stones, thanks to Her Royal Highness Kate Middleton. And what was once considered semi-precious gems, like maybe morganite, entered into that fine jewelry market. And then the late 2010s, it was round versus princess or cushion or emerald, or especially oval, because brides started to appreciate fancy cuts for the first time in a long time. Old was new. There was a reemergence of Art Nouveau and Art Deco styles, the reemergence of that 3-stone ring, thanks to Her Royal Highness Meghan Markle. There was the placeholder ring, so that temporary stand-in for the forever ring. I don't know if you remember, but there was a Hellsberg ad campaign with a posy style ring that was engraved with, "This is a ring, not the ring." And then also we saw man-engagement rings. So believe it or not, that was a failed attempt from the 1920s, but it's the man or the male engagement ring, and it actually is still gaining popularity today. So now we're in the 2020s. We've just started this decade, but I would say anything goes, although it is still about the halo, 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 at least for right now. We're seeing lots of alternative gemstones like colored center stones, lab-grown diamonds. If you're interested, you could check out our advanced lab-grown seminar coming up. Even moissanite has come into its own as a diamond substitute. We see a lot of unique settings. So maybe the horizontal east-west setting of the center stone, or compass prong setting, or claw-shaped prongs. If you're interested in jewelry like that and learning more, we do offer a 2-day jewelry forensics seminar you can check out. Engagement bands are becoming popular as opposed to the singular stone solitaires. And we're seeing a lot of heirloom inspired pieces, so replicas of period pieces, telling us that old is still new. So my personal prediction here is engagement ring doesn't need to be expensive, doesn't need to have diamonds, doesn't even need to have a gemstone, but just it does need to honor that 2,000-year-old tradition. So I thought I would share with you my favorite engagement ring. So this was my paternal great-grandmother's engagement ring from the early 1900s. It was passed down to my grandmother, and she removed the larger stones and she placed them in her own engagement ring. They were all old European cuts. And she passed this mounting down to me in 2005, shortly before her passing. I couldn't believe it was a perfect fit. And I had those orange and yellow sapphires set into the empty spaces where her larger diamonds were to give it sort of a unique mixture of old and new. It's one of my most precious possessions. It blows my mind to think that it is about 100 years old. So I thought I would take just a quick moment and touch on how to buy an engagement ring. First off, decide how much you want to spend. In the 1930s, we were looking at 1 month's income. In the 1980s, it was supposedly 2 months' income. In the 2000s, 3 months' income. So what I would suggest is calculate extra income for 1 year, and then that way, theoretically, it's paid off in a year. Do your homework. At the very least, learn about the 4 C's. GIA.edu is a great free resource for that, but understand that you kind of need to have a little wiggle room because nature is unpredictable. So I would say pick which one of the 4 C's, cut, color, clarity, or carat weight, is most important to you, and focus on that when you go looking to buy. Understand their taste in jewelry. Do they like modern or classic? Delicate, or do they want to make a statement? Do they like white or yellow metal? If you can, know their ring size. Just don't guess. Find a jeweler that you trust. Ask questions, ask opinions. They are the professionals. Don't feel rushed. And I would say, yes, you can buy online, but I always kind of say, would you buy a car online? Maybe, maybe not. Also, check out some of those vintage and antique rings if you want something that feels like you have a piece of history. But just celebrate that being having an engagement ring is being part of this ancient tradition, and keep in mind the symbolism that the engagement ring really represents. So there's a lot of great information. There's an infographic to recap the history of the engagement ring. You can check that out. Go on GIA.edu. There's lots of other great articles there to check out. There's a book by George Frederick Kuhns called Rings for the Finger. Oh, it's fantastic. And then also, I will kind of just throw out there is museumofdiamonds.org. It's an online museum where you get to share the story of your engagement ring. You even get to officially name your diamond. I think that's fantastic. So real quick, let's find out the results of the poll. I'm curious to know which one was the most popular. Art Deco. Yes, I'm not surprised. 41% for Art Deco, that period. I wonder if I had you guys with my little quote of it being described as not for the faint of heart, but for the bold of spirit. Maybe I have some people watching that really want to embrace that. So I think that's absolutely fantastic. I'm kind of with you on that with Art Deco. It's one of my faves. And with that, I'm going to throw it back to Natalie.
Hi, Kate. What a great presentation. I will have to say that my favorite is mid-century modern, but you and I have talked about that already. That is, I just think it's fantastic. We have a few questions for the audience, and we've got about 15 minutes left. So just a couple. This is an interesting one. If a couple breaks up, who gets the ring?
Oh, I've heard this question asked so many times, and unfortunately, there's really no straightforward answer. It kind of varies by jurisdiction. So sometimes it has to be legally returned to the giver, no matter who is quote unquote at fault for ending an engagement. But sometimes it actually depends if the marriage ceremony has taken place, because it could be considered that the gifting of the engagement ring has become complete with the ceremony. In some places, it's argued that if it was given on a traditional gift-giving holiday like Valentine's Day or Christmas, that it is a gift that belongs to the recipient. And even there is this interesting story that I read that took place in, I want to say, Australia, if I remember correctly, where a couple broke up. The man said the woman could keep the engagement ring. She threw it away. She wanted nothing to do with it. He found out, got really angry, sued her for the amount that it cost and won. So she actually had to pay about $11,000 to replace the ring that she threw away. So
Wow.
it is kind of different depending on where you live.
All right. So do you know the average price of an engagement ring today?
Today, so like I said, it's really interesting to look at the fact that in the 1940s, we were looking at, I believe it was about 1,800, if you adjust for today's inflation, compared to what I've read recently, or most recently, the average in the States is 5,600. Although, of course, that differs and changes depending on where you are in the United States, or if we're talking United States versus other countries. It's a really hard number to nail down. But there's lots of articles out there that you can just jump online and see. And it's really interesting, I think, to compare prices throughout the decades and watch both prices and both styles. Interests me.
Very interesting. All right. Can you tell us a little bit about wearing the ring on the left finger? Does everyone wear the engagement ring on the left finger?
Yeah, so I touched on that a little bit about the different traditions going through history, but really in Anglo-Saxon countries, the ring is customarily worn on the ring finger of the left hand, but customs vary considerably across the world. So in some countries, the engagement ring is worn on the fourth finger of the right hand, and this tradition is commonly followed in places like Russia and India, Scandinavian countries, some East European countries, and South American countries. I myself actually have friends that are from Iran and Iraq, and they wore their engagement rings on their right hand here in the States. So to each their own.
Okay, that kind of leads into our next question. We talked more about kind of engagement rings in Western Europe and in the West. Can you tell us a little about engagements maybe in other parts of the world?
Engagements in other parts of the world?
Or engagement ring, are engagement rings used all over the world, or are they mostly just in the West?
I will say most of the information that's out there, it touches more in the European cultures, and then coming into the US in more recent 21st century times, or 20th century and 21st century. So most of the research that's out there that I could get my hands on doesn't extend, all around the globe. As you can imagine, engagement rings, they have a similar history in terms of their meaning, especially if we go back to the very beginning of my presentation, where it was really just talking about the ancient Roman times, where the engagement ring was that symbol. So the tradition itself, we have found that it comes from that ancient Rome era, but it's sort of altered and changed in other countries. It would be impossible, I think, to kind of touch on every country and their engagement ring styles.
Great. Okay, one question. Can you tell us a little bit about the halo? Can you give an exact definition for what a halo is on the engagement?
Oh, absolutely. So the halo is typically when you have one center stone and then a circle of smaller stones around it. So from far away, it gives this big impact. So I would say that the halo style started probably more in the late 1990s when it was revived. Obviously, we talked about how this is a kickback or a nod to the Art Deco style, but in the late 1990s, early 2000s, we saw for engagement rings what were called jackets. So it is where a band would fit with a solitaire ring and kind of bling it up a little bit. And I think from there, people really wanted to always have the bling with that center stone. And so from there, jewelry designers started to say, hey, let's just do a circle of tiny stones to really capture the light and accentuate that center stone. Hopefully that answers the question.
Perfect. All right. So did engagement rings always have a diamond?
So no, I touched on that a little bit, but it's actually that fairly new tradition with engagement rings. So between the 1300s and the 1700s, some of those diamonds were being found in the fields of India, but they really couldn't be cut during that time. They didn't have the technology or the understanding because diamonds were harder than any other gemstone they had come across yet. So they were actually thought to have mystical powers. And because of that, typically they would end up with the nobility of China or definitely like European nobility at that time. In the 1700s, gold miners in Brazil discovered diamonds. And so it was kind of funny. They were gold miners, so they're searching for gold, and they came across these colorless rocks and didn't really know what they had at first. And they were actually using them as gambling placeholders, which is kind of funny. But eventually they discovered what they were, that they had discovered a new diamond source besides India. And so that meant more diamonds. It meant more kind of playing around. They learned that they could rub two diamonds together and start to affect one another and smooth each other out. They determined how, or they discovered how they could rub a rock with olive oil and diamond dust and grind it down to make that table cut. And so because the cutting was still pretty crude and difficult at the time, we saw a lot of really ornate metal work in the 18th and the 19th centuries, kind of to disguise the poorly cut diamonds. And then, like I had mentioned, in the late 1800s, when diamonds were discovered in South Africa, those were from the first primary source ever discovered. So primary source meaning they actually learned that diamonds came up from deep within the ground. And so a lot of those diamonds are what we call still in the pipe. So they had to dig for them, but it meant that there was more diamonds, much more diamonds than ever before being discovered. And it was that discovery that changed the face of engagement rings, along with the fact that cutting technology, the rotary saw was developed during the early 1900s, and that made a huge difference in being able to cut diamonds into a shape that made it look desirable. So once it was cut into this like sparkly shape, people were wanting them more. It was almost like everything coming together in unity, with the diamonds being found, the technology of cutting coming around, and then also with the wealth changing from nobility to really that monetary wealth and the US market emerging. And that's when we started to see engagement rings with diamonds in them.
Very cool. Okay, so another question. Why a diamond in an engagement ring?
Why
a
diamond?
Yeah, with all the stones.
I know there's so much controversy over like marketing just wants you to buy a diamond. Well, that's part of it. It is mainly because of good marketing. But the flip side of that, it's just the preferred gem to be worn every day for a lifetime, and then to pass it down, like my great-grandmother got to pass her ring down to my grandmother and down to me, because diamonds can withstand that wear and tear. They have this immense what's the word I'm looking for? Resistance to scratching. And so if you were to wear something like an opal engagement ring, although I know that they're out there, they really aren't meant to be worn every single day. So something like an opal engagement ring would be a horrible standard for engagement ring, because eventually it would probably, we call it crazing, but it would basically crack. But many other gemstones would as well. Now, there are some alternatives to diamonds that are great in terms of their hardness, their wearability, things like the ruby and the sapphire. So corundum is a great alternative. Morganite's a great alternative. Topaz is a great alternative, but none of those are as hard as diamonds. So you will see wear and tear on any of those other gemstones throughout, like I said, a lifetime of wearing an engagement ring, which hopefully one hopes that they're going to get to wear it for, let's say, 50 years, right? And then pass it down. And so I would say that, yes, it's marketing, but it's marketing the best gemstone for it.
Great answer. Can you tell us a little bit about maybe the most common cut today for engagement rings?
Oh yes, by far the round. So we're starting to see, and I think by cut you meant shape, right?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. So we're definitely starting to see people pay more attention to the fancy shaped diamonds. I'd say some of the more popular fancy shapes, still the princess, the cushion, the emerald, the oval, the marquise, the heart has a following as well. I think I touched on all the biggies. But by far, if you were to look at the number of round diamonds being cut versus the number of fancy shaped diamonds being cut, by far people are turning to the round brilliant. And there is reason for that. It is all about light. We talk about this in our diamonds and diamond grading course here at GIA, and you learn all about light return, but really light enters a diamond and it's very unique in how it bounces around, and it's cut in such a way that the light bounces back up at our eyes. So when we have it on our hand and we look at it, the light's entering and then bouncing back out at us and looking sparkly and beautiful. And so it's that round cut that has the capability to maximize light return more than any other cut. So I think that that's why people tend to still gravitate towards that. But I will say that I don't think I mentioned the pear. The pear has probably been the shape that has not gone in and out of style throughout the decades, recent decades, as much as all the other shapes. We saw the princess cut really have its time to shine in past decades. We saw the marquise really have its time to shine, and the oval more recently. But I will say that the downside of picking a fancy shaped diamond over a round diamond is that, as you can see from my presentation, they do start to get associated, just like different colored metals, start to get associated with different time periods, and it could look a little bit dated. But what we also learned from the presentation is that what goes around comes around. And so it's almost like, don't worry, it will become very much on trend at another point in history. So that's my 2 cents on that.
Kate, thank you so much. That was a great answer. And unfortunately, this is the end of our knowledge session for today. If you all have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to us on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. Don't forget, next week is our Knowledge Rocks Week, and we will have another knowledge session with Dr. Erin Palke and Emerald Tanner to tell us all about Southwest gems. And Kate, thanks so much for your time today. It was fantastic.
Thank you all, and I appreciate everybody who came and joined me today.